list today versus.
So Elliot usually joins from the US, no? And so
Yeah.
I guess that he may be one of the persons we may lose.
I think the issue was mostly for the panelists, probably because many panelists come from the US. And so it's not easy to find, in addition to the fact that I was a bit last minute, which didn't help.
Elliot usually joins from the US, no? Yes, I think so. I guess that he may be one of the persons we may lose. I see that Daniel Stepman is in the audience.
I think the issue was mostly for the panelists, probably because many panelists come from the US. And so it's not easy to find, in addition to the fact that I was a bit last minute, which didn't help.
Elliot usually joins.
There's some feedback.
Yes, sorry. It was my fault. Okay, so I think it is time that we start. So welcome everyone to the virtual seminars in economic theory. Today we are very happy to have Nicolas Lambert from MIT, who will present the paper, The Power of Referential Advice. This is joint work with Stephen Callander and Niko Matouschek. We were expecting Eyal Winter as guest panelist today, but due to some last-minute changes, he will not be able to join from the beginning. He may join along the talk. The format is a 60-minute presentation followed by 15 minutes of questions and answer session. And during the talk, okay, and this is an innovation for today, if you have a question, okay, you may feel free to unmute and ask the question live. Okay, so of course, I mean, since we are very many here, we ask you to bear that in mind and to try to minimize interruptions. You can also use the chat if you want, okay, and we can pass then the questions to Nicolas. The talk is recorded, and as a reminder, record that next week we will have with us Violeta Ciuda from Harris, Chicago, who is going to talk about the voters and the policy stability versus responsiveness trade-off, a joint work with Antoine Lepe. Well, thank you, Nicolas. Thank you for joining us today. The screen is yours.
Okay, well, thanks a lot for having me. I'm very delighted to be with you virtually and to give this seminar. So I'm going to talk about a paper called The Power of Referential Advice, and indeed joint work with Steve Callander and Niko Matouschek. And this is the motivation behind this paper. So experts, committees, people who look for information and give advice play a key role in pretty much every aspect of our economic, social, and political life. And if we look into the kind of advice that these experts give, we see that they take many forms. One common form is for the expert to simply give a recommendation. Think, for example, about a librarian who is recommending a book, and then you can decide if you want to borrow that book or if you want to borrow some other book. But quite often the advice is actually more expensive. So in this case, the expert does not convey just a recommendation, but it conveys information beyond the recommendation. It conveys contextual information. Think, for example, of a doctor who recommends the treatment, but also discusses with the patients alternative treatments. And then again, the patient can figure out for himself if he wants to follow the recommendation of the doctor or choose one of the other treatments that has been discussed. Now, there is broad evidence in the empirical literature that experts influence decisions to their personal advantage. We know, for example, from Gruber and Owings that obstetricians tend to manipulate patients into having too many C-sections. We know from Levitt and Syverson that realtors tend to manipulate homeowners into selling too quickly and cheaply. We know from Milgram and Robert that division managers tend to manipulate headquarters into funding too many projects. So there is this feeling, at least at the empirical level, that experts tend to try to manipulate decision makers to their own benefits. And in this paper, what we're trying to figure out at a theoretical level is how and if and how experts can use this extra information to sway decisions in their favor. And we're going to do that in the most difficult situation for the experts. That is, we are going to assume that the experts and the decision maker care about two very different dimensions. So that if you're going to look at an equilibrium under soft information, cheap talk equilibrium, the equilibrium you'd get is unique and entirely uninformative. It will be babbling because there is no possibility to align interests. So what we'll do is instead look at a model with verifiable information, where any information that is provided by the expert can be verified by the decision maker. And we'll see that if it's done poorly, that extra information, which has to be truthful anyways, is going to hurt the experts. Intuitively, that doesn't sound very surprising because of the fact that when you give more information to the receiver, to the decision maker will take that information to his own benefit, try to maximize his own utility. But it turns out that if it's done well, we'll see that the expert is able to use that information to shape the beliefs of the decision maker in his favor, and so as to reach a decision which is to his own benefits. So that's the idea behind what we're doing here. Now, let me briefly go over the literature. And in fact, let me see, I should keep track of time. I always forget to do that. So, okay. So in the interest of time, what I'm going to do is I'm going to skip the details of this, and I'm happy to come back to it if there is any question later on. Let me just say that our paper is mostly linked to two streams of the very rich literature on strategic communication. And these streams are the literature on rich information and on hard information. One key difference between our model and the majority of the models in these streams of the literature is that we are going to look for rich information from the expert standpoints. So there is going to be a large asymmetry of information. The information itself is going to be highly dimensional. So a rich information space, but at the same time, that's going to contrast with a very coarse action space, which is going to be low dimensional. So you have rich information on one hand, very simple low dimensionality of action space or decision space on the other end, which means that you don't need to know a lot to make the optimal decision. In fact, in our model, the optimal decision can be made with only a little bit of information. So instead, the standard, the experts, is going to use this extra redundant information to figure out ways by which he can benefit from convincing the decision maker to move his decision in a way that benefits our experts. So if there is no question at this point, I'm going to go straight to the model. So we're going to have one sender who is the expert and one receiver who is the decision maker. And for the purpose of the talk, I'm going to only focus on this language of sender-receiver, which is the usual traditional language in this literature. But if you want to, if it helps to have a concrete situation to keep in mind, you can think about the receiver as being, for example, a policymaker who is going to try to decide about the reform on, let's say, the healthcare system. And the sender is an expert that provides advice and recommendations to that policymaker. We are going to have a set of options, finitely many of them, n+1. So from the option set is this script D here, and we are going to have options from D0 to Dn, and these options are going to be real numbers. In fact, it's helpful to think about this healthcare reform in that sense, because you can attribute to each option the magnitude of the reform. So each option di is going to be equal to I multiplied by delta. Why don't we just use integers? And we use delta to be the distance between two different options. You'll see that briefly it's going to be something that will make complete sense in a few minutes. But if you think about the receiver as being our policymaker deciding on a reform, you can think about D0 as being one extreme, no reform at all, status quo level, and Dn to be the most extensive reform, the most extreme reform that can be made. And so the decision or options between D0 and Dn are going to correspond to various intensity of the reform, from low intensity to high intensity. Now, each option is going to give an outcome. And so we are going to have one special option, which is option 0, which is what we call the default option, but that corresponds really to the status quo level in our healthcare reform system. And this default option is going to have an outcome normalized to 0. And that is going to be known by every agent in the population. It's going to be public. You don't change anything, you get the status quo outcome. And then for any option which is non-zero, the option is going to generate an outcome, and this outcome is going to be distributed according to a random walk, a Gaussian random walk. And so that's the increments are going to follow this form right here. And so that's the increment for switching from option DI to the next option, DI plus 1 or DI plus separately delta. And there is here a drift component and a variance component. So let's not focus on the formula, but just we can see easily what we're trying to do here is say that the outcome increments, let me use that, the outcome increments from one particular option to an option further to the right is going to have a part of an effect which is predictable and part of an effect which is going to be noise. So the effect which is predictable is that the outcome increment is going to be increasing on average. It's going to be proportional, that increase is going to be proportional to a drift parameter, mu, and to the magnitude between the different options, delta. Similarly, when you increase your current option from D to D plus delta, you're going to increase the amount of variance, and that variance will be proportional to a scale parameter, sigma or sigma squared, and again, the magnitude of the difference between the two different options, delta. Okay, so that means that essentially, as you increase the amount of reform, you're going to increase the outcome on average, but you're also going to increase the amount of uncertainty. And our receiver, our policymaker here, wants to implement the right reform. So there is the right amount of reform to implement. The expert, however, will want to implement the reform which is closest as good as possible to the status quo level. And so this is going to be the preferences that we're going to make explicit in the next slide. So as said, mu corresponds to the rate of change from one option to the next. So the higher the mu, the more the expected rate of change, the more the increase of outcome on average. And sigma corresponds to the noise parameter, and it's going to give us a sense of the complexity of the outcome function, or said otherwise, the extent of the asymmetry of information between our two players. The greater the amount of sigma, the more there is asymmetry of information between the sender and the receiver. And the state of the world is going to simply be theta. It captures essentially all the noise included in my outcome function. In fact, it may simplify to say that the state of the world is exactly the outcome function. These are equivalents. It's just a matter of notation. Okay, so this is for the outcome function. Now, our interest is going to be in large option sets. And so now we're going to normalize, we're going to use a delta, which is normalized in a way that when n is going to grow, so when the option set grows large, the outcomes become the realization of a stochastic process, which is very simple. It's going to be a Brownian motion with a drift mu and a scale sigma. So graphically, it's going to look like this picture, where on the x-axis you have the option, which now becomes anything on the real line, on the positive real line, and on the y-axis, you have the outcome, okay? And so the outcome function will be exactly the realization of one of these Brownian motions as depicted on this picture. The only reason why we don't start from this as a baseline model is technical. So we need to actually use finitely many options for some purely technical reasons, but really what we have in mind is large option sets. So quite often in the talk, I will use this kind of pictures, which have to be interpreted as being the case of having large option sets. Timing is going to be as follows. So the sender is going to first observe all of this private information, all of the state of the world. So we will know exactly what is the outcome for every possible option. He's going to then send a message to the receiver. And upon receiving the message, the receiver will update his beliefs and make a decision. And then the payoffs are going to realize. Now, let me tell you about these payoffs and about the communication. So the payoffs, the preferences of our agents are going to be simple utility functions. For the sender will have a utility that corresponds to him preferring options which are as close as possible to the status quo level. So for simplicity, we are going to use this negative utility, which simply means that the greater the option, the more the reform, the less happy our sender is. Note that the sender is only going to care about the option chosen by the receiver, but not about the outcome that realizes. This is in exact contrast to the receiver, who only cares about the outcome and not the option. So the amount of reform by itself is not something that is of interest to our receiver. What the receiver cares about is the outcome of that reform, which has a stochastic component. Our receiver is going to have a quadratic utility, which is so common in the strategic communication literature for its tractability. And so what this captures here is the receiver will want to implement an outcome as close as possible to a bliss point, and the quadratic nature is going to make it so that he's going to be averse to risk. Okay. In fact, if you look at the expected utility of the receiver that he will want to maximize, you can express this as a mean variance type of preference, where the receiver wants to get a mean as close as possible to B. This is this component here. But at the same time, is going to incur a cost of having a variance of the outcome. So there is going to be a trade-off between getting the mean close to the bliss points and reducing the amount of risk. This is only for the purpose of the presentation. By the way, in the paper, we have it much more general than that. But for the presentation, I think that gives a really good sense of what's going to happen. Communication. So we said the sender is going to send a message. What this message can be? Well, in our model, the message is going to be simple. The sender is going to decide for every single option whether he wants to reveal the outcome of that option or not. So a message is simply a mapping that maps options to real values or the empty sets. If it maps to the empty sets, it means the sender simply refuses to disclose the outcome of that option. If it's equal to real value, then that has to be exactly equal to the outcome of that option. That is, the sender cannot lie. So that corresponds to a model of verifiable information. The sender doesn't have to communicate everything, but what he communicates has to be truthful. Okay. We could consider more general message spaces, but again, that's going to be enough for our purpose. Finally, the strategies. So the sender is going to have a strategy that corresponds to a mapping from all the possible states of the world, which you can view as being all the possible outcome functions, to the set of messages, which I note as script M, like here. The receiver strategy is simply a decision that maps every possible message to a decision, which is one option among the option sets. And then we are going to have a belief function for the receiver that is a mapping from the set of possible messages 2, and there is a typo here, this to the distributions of the states of the world. So it's a very simple triple, and our solution concept is standard and corresponds to perfect Bayesian equilibrium, which we can recall briefly as saying the sender is going to maximize his expected utility given the receiver strategy. The receiver will maximize his expected utility given his belief, and his belief in turn is going to satisfy Bayes' rule whenever possible. And we're not going to put any restriction on the off-path beliefs at this stage. The only restriction that we're going to make in the model is that the bliss points of the receiver is going to be at least as large as this quantity, sigma square over 2 mu, which will come back often in the talk. And the intuition behind this quantity, you can view this quantity, sigma square over 2 mu, as being a proxy for the complexity of the outcome function. The greater this quantity, the more complex the outcome function is, and the greater the amount of information asymmetry between the experts and between the sender and the receiver. And so what happens is that if that information asymmetry explodes, if there is a tremendous amount of uncertainty, then what happens is that the equilibrium, it is possible for the sender to get his first best in equilibrium. Not revealing anything will lead the receiver to take the status quo level, and that's not the situation that's very interesting to us. So we're just going to assume this to avoid this situation. Okay. One last point about the model, coming back to the idea that we have different sort of advice. There is two kinds of advice that we want to look at, and this is really the focal points of our paper. One kind of advice is conative advice, and that's when the sender is going to reveal only one option, correspond to the story about the librarian recommending a book. So conative advice, the sender reveals the outcome of only one option, and the receiver is going to select that revealed option. And then in contrast, we have the referential advice that corresponds to the doctor story in my introduction. Here, the sender is going to reveal more than one option, so 2 or more options, and the sender will choose one of the revealed options. Why conative and referential? It's just because that's a terminology that's borrowed from Jacobson's six functions of language. Jacobson was one of the key linguists in the 20th century that defined different functions of the language, among which conative, which essentially means giving an order or making a recommendation, and referential, which essentially means providing contextual information. So we use his terminology for our model. And so the goal of the paper would be to try to figure out what can be done under the two different kinds of advice, in particular from the viewpoints of the sender. We're also interested principally in prescriptive advice, which means the receiver will pick an option that is revealed by the sender, which is then interpreted as a recommendation. You can think about another kind of advice where I give you some information about options, but the receiver is going to decide an option that has not been revealed. Is going to decide to experiment, and that can be sustained in equilibrium. It's not easy to sustain, but it can be sustained. In most of the talk, I'm mostly going to be interested in prescriptive advice. Also, it's not an assumption, so I will make ex ante.
So, Nicolas, we have a question, okay? In the healthcare reform example, what is the interpretation of B?
So B would be saying you want an outcome that is corresponding to the right level of outcome for you, which would mean, for example, something that there's always a trade-off in general. So in the case of a healthcare reform, you might want to say that you want to have a positive effect of the health of the population, but something that would not be too expensive, for example. The B captures in a reduced form what this kind of trade-off might be. So an outcome which is too large or too low is not going to be perfect. But it's true, it's quite abstract in the model. The same thing about the pandemic, for example. You might say you want to vaccine a number of people, but maybe giving the vaccine to everyone is not going to be having a positive effect. You actually need to vaccine only 70% of the population, for example, right? So there are cases where you know exactly the outcome and how to get it. In our model, the outcome has some uncertainty, and so the receiver is not quite sure about what is the right level of reform, because there is not a perfect mapping between the amount of the reform or the action that is taken and the outcome that is realized.
Can I follow up on that with a quick? So I guess maybe a more natural sort of setup would be allowing B to depend on the policy that's chosen, right? I'm just wondering do you think your results are going to be sensitive to that? It's like if B is increasing in X in a certain way, for instance.
So so you can have preferences that for the receiver that would also depends on the amounts of the reform. Yes, in fact, in the first version of the paper, we used to have an extension that included a notion of costs for the receiver, in a sense that the greater the option, the greater the cost. So the option would correspond really to essentially a cost parameter. And so many of the results that we have can be extended to that situation. I think one way to perhaps interpret the model that I'm presenting here is to say it's really a baseline, but indeed it's a stylized model. And so we're going to have the problem that it's a good model to have to study the effects at the general level to see what's really the key driving force. But the side effect of that is that it's not going to match a situation perfectly, such as the healthcare reform system, which is a general story to keep in mind, but it's not going to be a perfect fit for the general model.
Thank you.
So if there is no more questions, I'll move to the next part, which is on the necessity of equilibrium advice. Why do we want to ask this question? It's because if you use that model in a cheap talk soft information framework, you'll see that no equilibrium is the only equilibrium, which raises the question of, can we actually have no advice as an equilibrium in this setup? And the answer is no. If the option set is large enough, you can't have an advice. No advice is not going to be an equilibrium. There is always a standard type who will disclose the outcome of at least one non-default option. And to give you a sense of why that's true, I need to introduce some ideas that I will make use of later. These ideas are information spillovers. So in the talk, in fact, I'm going to try to remain as high level as possible to not dive into mathematical details, which are hard to discuss anyway in a 1-hour presentation. And I think it's still going to give you a good sense of what's happening. When the sender reveals some information on some options, because of the fact that the outcomes are correlated, this information is going to impact the beliefs of the neighboring unrevealed option. If I tell you the outcome of a reform, if you change a bit the reform amount, you'll get a good sense of the effects of this change of reform. So the first example would be a case where the sender reveals an outcome of some particular option, DA, and of course, that's going to impact the beliefs of the outcomes of options around DA. We call this direct spillover to give the sense that this information comes exclusively from the knowledge of the outcome of our option DA. But in general, of course, in a strategic setup, these spillovers can be both direct and indirect. Here's an example of an indirect spillover. You have two different options, DA and DB, that are fixed. And you imagine that the sender is going to reveal the outcome of option DA, but only if the outcome of that option is less than, for example, B/2. It could be any other number. If not, then the sender reveals the outcome of the option DB. Okay? Now what happens? Well, if you see that the message is outcome of option DB, you get two things. You get one thing is a direct spillover from the knowledge of the outcome of DB. So you can estimate how the outcome is around DB, exactly as we had in the first example. But of course, there is more that you can infer than what is just part of the message. What you can infer, if you know the standard strategy, is that if the sender revealed to you the outcome of DB, then it must be because the outcome of dA is greater than b over 2. So this part of the inference is not being captured by the message itself, it's being captured by the fact that you know something about the strategy of the sender. So this we call indirect spillover. And so it's useful to distinguish between these two effects. And it turns out that if you look at direct spillovers only, that's helpful because they generate what we call neutral beliefs, which is simply capturing the idea that your belief for the receiver will be exactly equal to the initial distribution of the states that is conditioned on the hard information included in the message. In other words, the receiver takes the message at face value. And the benefit of considering these kinds of direct spillovers is that they make beliefs very tractable. So many of the equilibria and strategies we consider will have this particular direct spillover features and will generate these neutral beliefs. And it can be helpful to make the connection between these kinds of direct spillovers and the strategies that generate them. And it turns out the strategies that generate these neutral beliefs, as you can probably already imagine, are the ones where the deviations can be detected by the receiver. In other words, if it's the case that the sender wanted to deviate from the equilibrium message, the receiver would be able to detect it. And this makes it possible to have the receiver condition only on the information in the message and not on the strategy. Formally, this strategy corresponds to saying that each state is compatible with only one possible message. Of course, it doesn't mean that each state is one message, because you can have one message that pools many states. But the fact is, if you look at on-path messages, once you know the states, you know the message. There is no other possibility for the sender to switch between different messages given a state. I think that's helpful for two reasons. One is robustness, because these kind of strategies give a sense of robustness in the sense of, in this kind of equilibria where senders use these strategies, the receiver does not have to anticipate what the sender is doing in terms of strategizing. He can just look at the message and form his beliefs purely on the message and not the strategy. Second, it's going to help with credibility because of the fact that two sender types cannot imitate each other. The more you make it easy for the sender types to imitate another, the more difficult it is to sustain an equilibrium. And so that is going to help with building credibility. So a lot of our equilibria are going to have these features, but we don't impose it ex ante. So back to the questions of whether the sender can say nothing. It turns out he can't. And remember that given our quadratic preferences, the sender will want to choose an option that maximizes the trade-off between the average outcome and the amount of risk of that outcome. If you were in a situation where no advice was the only possible message, so the empty message really, then this equilibrium would generate neutral beliefs, and then you can very easily compute what's the optimal trade-off. And it appears on this figure. The optimal trade-off is for the receiver to choose an option that has a mean which is exactly equal to his bliss points minus this value which we met later, and which we met earlier, the sigma square over 2 mu that captures the complexity of our outcome function. So on the graph, the Brownian path here corresponds to an outcome function, a particular realization. The blue line corresponds to the average outcome, and the distance between the red line corresponds to the amplitude of the variance. Okay, and so the optimal trade-off for him is to say, I want an outcome on average which is close to the bliss point, but not too close, because if it's too close, I'm going to get a second order benefits, whereas I'm going to get a first order cost from the variance. And that's due to the quadratic nature of the preference. Okay, but that's true very generally. If you have a smooth enough function, you're going to have the similar feature as in the quadratic function. Okay, so now we know that DNA is going to be the optimal option chosen by the receiver in that situation of no advice. In this particular example depicted on this graph, the sender doesn't have particular reason to deviate, but you could imagine a different sender type who has this outcome function, for example. So I'm just doing a Boolean path here that increases, decrease, decrease, but it crosses our bliss points right here. It crosses it before DNA. So what happens then? Well, this kind of sender would actually benefit from deviating and revealing all of its information. And then the receiver would just choose an option, which is here corresponding to giving him the best possible outcome. And that's going to be also better for the sender. So there is a profitable deviation. And these kinds of profitable deviations happen with positive probability. So what we get is essentially something that's a little bit like the unraveling arguments of traditional models like Milgram or Milgram-Roberts, where you have senders that find that they can actually be better off by full disclosure in the context of no advice. And you might ask if that's going to yield to the complete unraveling argument. And it turns out the answer is no. So in our setup, the unraveling is going to stop here, really. There's not really any real unraveling, and you'll be able to sustain equilibria which don't have full revelation. Okay, so the next natural type of equilibria that would make sense to discuss is the case of full revelation. We know that no equilibrium, no advice can't be an equilibrium. The question is, are we going to get equilibria that correspond to the classical equilibria with models of verifiable information, the full revelation equilibria? And turns out the answer is yes. And I don't want to spend too much time on this. So let me just go to the point here. The answer is yes, but it requires to have very extreme beliefs. It requires to say that in some cases, when I don't reveal an option, then the receiver will believe that the reason why I don't reveal the option is because the outcome is essentially my ideal outcome or something extremely close to my ideal outcome. So these are essentially knife edge beliefs that have almost no variance. For these reasons, these equilibria are not very neutral. In fact, I'll present briefly an equilibrium refinement that is going to rule out these equilibria. And that is in sharp contrast with the standard models of verifiable information, such as the Milgram or the Milgram-Roberts model, where by unraveling, you have that not only fully revealing equilibria are natural, but in fact, they are the only existing equilibria. And there is a number of papers like Sandmine and Winter, like Rappaport, like many other papers that have extended this standard framework to tell us exactly when it is the case that we can expect to have these uniqueness of the fully revealing equilibria. In our case, these results are not going to apply, and we'll have a rich set of possible equilibria. And again, in the interest of time, I'm not going to discuss this too much, so I'm going to go directly to the main points. There's other equilibria which are going to be optimal for the receiver, but the fact is all of these equilibria are going to necessitate that the sender discloses a tremendous amount of information. And for this reason, to sustain these equilibria, you have to impose knife edge of path beliefs, which are not very natural. We have a refinement here, which I don't want to discuss in detail, that we call the bird in the hand refinement, to capture the idea that the idiom, a bird in one hand is better than two in the bush. And this is exactly capturing this idea by saying, if I was going to modify a bit, perturb a bit the off-path beliefs, I should be able to to have to not change the decision of the receiver. And it turns out these equilibria, receiver optimal equilibria, none of them satisfies this perturbation requirements. If you change a bit of path belief, you're going to destroy the equilibrium. So point is, these equilibria exists, but they are not the most natural. Okay, so far we have what? We have that no communication can't be an equilibrium. We have that full communication is an equilibrium, but it's fragile. And so the next step is, can we do better for the sender? Can we have another equilibrium which is both more natural, but also that is going to make the sender better off than just disclosing everything? Okay, so if there is no question, I'm going to move to that part of the presentation. So the equilibrium that I'm going to introduce next is using what we call first point conative strategy. And it's a very simple strategy for the sender. It corresponds to saying that you're going to reveal the smallest option whose outcome falls into a band around the bliss point. So in other words, you look at the options that make the receiver relatively well off, because you're going to be delta away from his bliss point, and you're going to reveal the one that is best for you as a sender. And if that doesn't exist, then you're going to reveal the entire option set. So that you can think about this strategy as being somewhat between conative and referential advice, because in some cases you reveal only one point, in some other case you reveal everything. But as the option set grows large, it turns out for a fixed parameter delta, you are going to become conative in the limit fully, because your buoyant path will always cross this area around the bliss point. So we can think about this in the limit as being a fully conative strategy. How does it work? Why is it the case that you don't have to reveal everything as opposed to our receiver optimal equilibria? It's because here we are transforming the standards into an absolute standard. The reason why you have to provide lots of information in a context of receiver optimal equilibria is because you have to say, that's the option that's best for you. And to prove this to you, I have to reveal all the other options that are worse for me to prove to you that these are in fact the option I revealed to you turns out to be the one that is best for you. If I don't reveal that extra information, there is no way for the receiver to know that. In this case, I'm just telling the receiver, here's an option that falls into that band. Since delta is an exogenous parameter, the receiver can check this for himself. And so for this reason, you don't have to provide additional information to sustain this as an equilibrium. And so it turns out that as long as your band is small enough around B, that is going to be an equilibrium strategy. And in fact, you can have two extremes in this situation. The range of possible parameter values where that first point conative equilibrium will be indeed an equilibrium is where our band is somewhere between 0 and has a maximum amplitude that is delta max. It doesn't really matter. You don't have to focus on the formula here. But the point is that there is, in fact, a maximum width, which is going to converge to our classical value sigma square over 2 mu that we've met several times already. And if you look at the different possibilities here, you get all the extremes. You get, as delta goes to 0, the equilibrium will tend to be optimal for the receiver and do approximately as best as full revelation. And as delta goes to delta max, so as you increase the size of the band, that equilibrium is going to become optimal for the sender among the conative equilibria. And so I'm going to argue that in a minute, but these are the two extremes that we get out of this family of equilibria.
And Nicolas, I have a question, a clarifying question. Yes, so I didn't understand what's the meaning of first point conative strategy. In particular, I didn't understand, I think you mentioned it, but I didn't get what you said about if no such option exists. It always exists, right? Or with probability.
Yeah, so it turns out not true, because if you look, you're right that if you look at the Brownian case, which is in fact the one that I want people to focus on, it's always going to exist with probability 1. But since we consider n finite to get our results, large but finite, there is always a possibility that if you look at, let's see, maybe I have a picture here. Yeah, if you look at this band, so anything that is in here, it's perfectly possible that you have a point that starts here, and then the outcome moves on the other side of the band here, and you can jump. But indeed, as it turns out, it's not going to matter for us, because that's going to happen with vanishing probability as n grows large. And so I agree with you that I really want people to focus on the case where it's always going to cross.
Okay.
So this second point, referential advice, is, I would say, strictly speaking, but it's not very relevant for us. So let me actually skip the pictures, because I don't think that's very informative. Let me just say that the reason why we have a delta max, in fact, we have it here, a delta max, which corresponds to saying that the band has to be, it cannot be too much below B. So this is the extent. This is corresponding to B minus delta max here for n very large. So this is the solid line here corresponds to the part of the band that is the largest possible that you can get to sustain an equilibrium. The reason why you have to do that is because if you were going to stop earlier, the receiver would actually find it profitable to deviate to get himself closer to the bliss points on average. That is, because of the quadratic nature of the utility, you can view that as being a quadratic cost. If you are too far from the bliss points, if your average outcome is too far from the bliss points, you're going to incur a very high cost. In that case, it's best for you to experiment, incur a little bit of risk, but you're going to get a tremendous benefit from having an average outcome that becomes closer to your bliss point. So that's the reason why intuitively you can't have a band around B which is too large. Okay, so one may wonder about other kinds of conative advice, because that's only one type of strategy, which is natural and simple to explain, but it turns out you've made different ways to build equilibria with conative advice, and it turns out you can't do any better. So in fact, the range of outcomes that we have seen that correspond to the range of outcomes that can be implemented in our first point conative equilibria are in fact the entire range of possible outcomes that you can implement in any conative equilibria, first point or anything else. And this is what this theorem says. So I'm not going to go over the proof because I think this is not the best use of the time, but if you have time in the end, I'm happy to discuss a little bit the intuition behind this. The key point is that by using conative advice, you end up doing something that's good for the receiver, but not so good for the sender. So the sender will actually not benefit much from using communication where you only reveal one option corresponding to only one recommendation. And we can view it this way. Why is it good for the receiver? Well, because even in the worst case for the receiver, the equilibrium outcome is going to converge to B minus our delta max, the maximum size of the band, which when n grows large correspond to our usual value sigma square over 2 mu. And remember that this was exactly what the receiver would get on average without advice. So that was exactly corresponding to the optimal trade-off for the receiver who receives no advice and so form neutral beliefs about the distribution of outcomes. So what happens is that if you use conative advice, and if you use conative advice, which is the worst possible conative advice for the receiver still ends up having an outcome which on average is as good as what he would get before, but without the noise. Because in that case, the outcome that the receiver gets is something that has absolutely no noise. So, of course, the receiver is always going to be strictly better off than without advice, even in the worst case. Now, if you look at the sender case, it turns out, remember the preference of the sender in a baseline model is linear, the equilibrium option is going to be equal to the option that is chosen by the receiver without advice. So that even in the best possible case for the sender, so even in that case, where you choose the band which is the largest possible, the sender is at best as well off as if the sender had not communicated any advice. We know it's not an equilibrium, but it's a good benchmark. If the sender does not exist, it turns out that what he's going to get outside of the decision of the receiver, who is going to make the decision without any advice, is actually better off than what he would get if he was going to use any conative equilibrium. So any equilibrium when you reveal only 1 point. So clearly that illustrates that conative advice is in general not good for the sender. At best, it's going to be as good as what the sender would get without giving any advice to the receiver. Okay. Now, this means that we have two extremes so far. We have one extreme where we reveal everything, and of course, that's not good for the sender. We have one other extreme where we reveal only one piece of information. These equilibria are actually quite robust. They satisfy the refinements that we had earlier, but it turns out these are not very good for the sender. And so there is something intermediate, which is actually something that does quite well for the sender, which is what we call interval strategy. And the idea behind this is very simple. And in fact, I want you to focus on the interpretation more than the formula above. The interpretation says this: what the sender will do is going to follow a stopping rule. So it's going to start disclosing outcomes of options starting from the status quo level. It's going to start disclosing these outcomes up to some points where the receiver simply does not want to experiment. So I'm going to reveal the status quo. At this point, the receiver still wants to experiment if he has neutral beliefs. So I'm going to reveal one more option. If I see that if I was going to reveal that the receiver would experiment and take some other option, I'm going to reveal more and more and more, up until the point where the receiver actually has enough information to say, I'm going to choose an option among those revealed, and I'm not going to experiment and choose an option which is further to the right that would actually make the sender worse off. Okay, turns out that's an equilibrium strategy. And let me see, in the interest of time, if I want to do that. Well, maybe not fully, but let me just say what happens here. What happens on this picture is you can see the blue, the Brownian path corresponding to my outcome function here. If I was going to employ the interval strategy on that example, what would happen is that the sender would reveal the part in this picture that is in red. So it's going to read things from the 0, and then it's going to go along, reveal all of these points, and then here it's going to stop. The reason is why it's going to stop is that our receiver, if he was going to experiment on the right, would incur a low payoff on average due to the fact that there is actually quite a bit of noise. And he finds that the payoff he would get by choosing this option corresponding to an outcome which is relatively close to his bliss points is making him better off. And so that's the idea behind these strategies. And then if we have time, we can talk a little bit about how exactly to choose the points DR that correspond to the rightmost points that is revealed by the sender. But at a general level, that's the idea. You're just going to reveal information from the status quo level just enough so that your receiver is better off choosing one of the options that you have revealed. And doing so, it turns out you don't need to reveal everything. You can stop before. In fact, not only you can stop before, but you can stop before the points that correspond to a point that is in the band. So you're going to actually be better than using your Conative advice. And this is exactly what these domination theorems are telling us about. So to be able to compare an Equilibria, I'm not going to use expected utility, which is a little bit tricky to work out here, and also not very meaningful because it's going to depend strongly on the different utility functions. Instead, I'm going to have a very strong notion of domination, which would basically mean that when equilibrium dominates another in some states, if the decision of the first equilibrium for the sender is closer to the status quo than the decision of the other equilibrium, so that any sender who has preferences for this for options closer to the status quo are going to be better off, not only once with the linear utility. Okay, and so that's the notion of domination that I want to employ. Is of course taking the perspective of the sender, and what we have is two facts. The first fact is that using that interval strategy, you are in fact going to dominate the Conative equilibria strictly with positive probability and weakly all the time. So there is always a positive set of states of the world where using referential advice is going to yield an outcome which is going to be better for the sender than using the simple advice that correspond to just giving a recommendation. That's the first point. And the second point is that we can actually push this further. If we look at the limit case, the Brownian case, so the limiting situation, very large option sets, any equilibrium which has Conative advice is going to be strictly dominated. So the first point corresponds to what would happen with a finite number of options. But if you consider infinite option sets, then this domination is going to be strict all the time. For every single realization, you are going to have the fact that referential advice will actually give you a better decision from the viewpoint of the sender comparing to just giving one recommendation. In addition, this equilibrium will satisfy the different refinements, one of which I discussed briefly earlier, the refinement that if you perturb the belief a little bit, you're not going to impact the off-path decision. So these are not going to be as fragile as the fully revealing equilibria. So that's one way by which we can improve the outcome from the standard perspective. Of course, I'm going to skip the proof intuition unless there's questions about it later. And the last result I want to discuss is the fact that the sender can't do much better than our interval strategy. So here we have a referential equilibrium where it's a very simple type of equilibrium where we argue the sender does better than both the single recommendation. It also does better than revealing everything. And it turns out as long as you want an equilibrium which is going to be dominating Conative equilibria, the interval equilibrium is the best thing you can do in that case. So as long as you want to dominate conative advice, you can't do better than doing the interval equilibrium. And this is a sense of this result, which to respect the time window, I'm not going to explore in details. But that's really the three main results that I wanted to discuss. I think I would take questions happily, but given time, I'll conclude and then I'll take questions if there is any about the previous parts of the presentation.
Thank you, Nicolas, for this very nice talk. So now it's
can I just conclude briefly? Just one minute for concluding. Yeah. So what have we seen in this talk? When we look at a model of strategic communication that accounts for two different kinds of advice: an advice that gives a single recommendation, and advice that gives contextual information in addition to the recommended option. The key ingredient of the model is to have this rich information that is modeled as some imperfectly correlated outcomes across the different options. We see that referential advice by itself does not help experts because revealing too much, essentially going towards full revelation, is an equilibrium and it will make the expert worse off. But if the expert is revealing the right amount of information, which is not too little, not too much, he will be able to sway decision in his favor compared to the situations of just revealing too little, just revealing a single recommendation. And under some conditions, the best possible way to reveal information is simply going to reveal the outcomes of a range of contiguous options. There is one more thing which we haven't talked about, but it's nice to keep in mind: the fact that rich advice can be so persuasive that more often than not, the decision maker will be worse off than if he got no advice at all, which may seem paradoxical, but what it really means is that the reason why the decision maker wants to listen to the experts is only because there's rare cases where he's going to have a huge utility loss. And that is going to drive many of the structure and the equilibria of our model. The power of the expert comes from the fact that it allows him to avoid these rare disasters. The main message, if you abstract away from the details of the model, would be to say that the decision maker would benefit from rules and norms that require simple advice, so that contextual information is not going to be helping the experts to bias decisions towards the status quo level. So that's the conclusion. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm very happy to take questions if there is any.
Well, thank you, Nicolas, for the talk. So it's no time to questions. So if you want to raise a question, okay, so probably you can first express your intention in the chat, and then we can pass you, we can give you the opportunity. Any question? So I have a very simple question, a very naive question, but let's see if somebody else have something in mind. Okay, so my question is as follows. So, so if I take your model seriously, I should conclude that an expert should never acquire information if he's to provide conative advice. Am I getting it right?
So can you repeat the question?
Yes, if I take your model seriously, okay, so I understand that there are many simplifications, but if I take face value, your model, I should basically interpret that experts should not acquire information if they expect to provide conative advice. Is that correct? Is that the right way?
So it's yes and no. I think the problem is to be able to provide the conative advice, you need to know information that you don't reveal. To be able to sustain, for example, if you only know if you only know one point on your outcome path. So if you suppose that you gather some information that gives you a sense of what a particular reform would do, but not all the other reforms, this may not be enough to sustain an equilibrium. It would be enough for you to provide conative advice, but that might not be an equilibrium in the first place. So even when you provide a single recommendation, you need to know how this recommendation is going to compare with other undisclosed options. But indeed, the model says that you would rather avoid doing an investigation that would only generate advice that has this simple form. The best you can do is revealing information beyond just a recommendation.
There is another question from my colleague, Max Quiet.
Yes, sorry, very interesting, super interesting, and I think I'm gonna have to read the paper, which I notice is very long, by the way. But anyway, I was more of in the context of the literature. You skipped the literature slide. There was, I remember there was a paper on attributes that use similar framework of Gaussian, Brownian motions and stuff. So the idea was there that
is it one of those papers, or maybe I don't know if I don't
know by Bardi, Ariana Bardi, on attributes, and I was just thinking what the difference was, whether this was on communication chip talk, or was it I was just trying to place it, relative to that. But
I think so. So I'm not sure I know exactly which paper you're referring to. So maybe I should look into it and make sure we also cite it in the paper. But if it's in chip talk, the one feature of the model that we have here is that the chip talk equilibrium is not going to be very interesting, precisely because the experts and the decision maker care about two completely orthogonal dimensions. One of them cares about the implemented decision, the other cares about the outcome that realizes. And because we take these very stark assumptions, we end up having a chip talk equilibrium, which is pure babbling, because there is no alignment of incentive between those two options. So in that case, if that paper does discuss a soft information model, then I think the mechanics would actually be very different, because the integrity of the results in our case purely come from the fact that the sender has the power to provide information that is verified. If we remove that feature of the model, then we don't get anything interesting.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks. I mean, the problem is that I don't, honestly, I don't remember, about that paper. It's just that I remember the mechanics of that, which use similar framework, and I just don't recall the details.
Yeah, in the chat, maybe if you can just make sure so that I know for sure the paper. If you can just point out one of the authors or something, then I will look at it after the talk and make sure we cite it and see the connection between those papers.
Any other question? So I have another simple question. Okay, so I mean, equilibrium selection seems to be a big issue in your model. Okay, and one may wonder whether in this equilibrium selection argument it could play a role, one of the assumptions that you make that seems perhaps too extreme in reality, in particular that it is common knowledge that the information is hard information. Okay, so I wonder whether you put an epsilon probability that maybe that information is not there, it doesn't exist, or is.
That's a fair point. And so we have we have some extensions around this line, maybe not exactly this precisely, but for example, we allow for an extension where the sender does not really know the outcome for sure. Yeah. So in that case, he has some information, but this information is not as perfect as in the model that we saw here, and we can still get something non-trivial happening. We can still get the same type of results. I think what you're asking is probably a little bit different, because you're wondering what happens if there is uncertainty about the fact that the sender has, in fact, I think we cite here one of those. It's, I think that's probably the DIA model, right? You're probably referring to that paper where there is a question about the sender having access to the information in the first place. And to be honest, I'm not sure. I think there is continuity. So I think that if you take the model and perturb it by a tiny epsilon, thinking that there is a small probability that the sender does not know much of anything, the results are going to work out, because essentially these situations will be quite analogous to the situations where the sender does not know the outcome perfectly. But at the same time, I think if you increase that probability, I think it's going to break out before the point where you have the cheap talks. That is, it's very possible that, I'm just going to make a number, but if you say that with 50% chance the sender does not know anything, it might be the case that you actually get babbling in that situation. And so you're going to destroy the equilibria of the paper. I'm not sure, but that's a possibility.
Oh, I see. So let me see if I get it right. So basically what you're saying is that any equilibrium should be robust to small perturbations in the knowledge of the sender. I see.
Exactly. Okay. At least the equilibria that we identify, the interval equilibrium and the conative. The full revelation is a bit tricky because it's very sensitive to the beliefs, but the other ones are not so sensitive. So there is a sense of robustness that actually is quite strong, but at the same time, it's not quite clear how far we can push the deviation, how far we can push the epsilon.
Yeah, thank you. Any other question? So we still have 3 minutes remaining.
So so the discussion it didn't join, right?
Yeah, I don't think he didn't join today. Yeah, I mean, he apologized for not being able to.
No, it's totally fine. I just wanted to see if he was in the room, if he was able to join or not. But yeah, it happens. No problem at all. I think,
I have it's more like a stream of consciousness observation than a question. I make it short though. So I was wondering about this experimentation that the decision maker can take decisions that are not suggested in theory, even though he doesn't do that in equilibrium, possibly. I mean, in reality, that might not even be possible. So then it would be quite trivial if the sender doesn't say anything, then you can only stay with the status quo. But yeah, I was just wondering in the application when you can or cannot take an option that you don't know even exists, basically, and what other restrictions there might be. But yeah, it's just.
So you're asking. So should the model be so that we're only having the receiver taking an option among the ones that have been discussed with the sender, with the experts? That is.
Yeah, I mean, I see that it would not be very interesting then the paper if so. In the example, like with the doctor, I might not even have the option to take a treatment that was not recommended to me, and unless I go on the internet and
Yeah, I think I completely agree. I think there's many situations where I think for the political, the policymaker healthcare example, you might say that the policymaker could decide to do something that is going beyond the recommendations. That could be a possibility. But at the same time, I think that's for many other applications, like the doctor example, it's hard to imagine that a patient would just do a treatment that is not being recommended by the doctor. In that case, at the same time, I think the way to interpret the result of this model would be to say, we have an outside option. That is, the patient who sees a doctor can decide just to reject the option and go see some other doctor, go try to see some other hospital, find some experimental treatment, something else. And so that would be the analog of trying to choose an option which is not part of ones that have been disclosed, just because these options are not good enough from the standpoints of the standard. That might be one way to conciliate the two models.
Okay, so I think it's time that we finish the official part of the seminar. Okay, so thank you, Nicolas, for joining us today. It's been a pleasure to have you here. Thank you also, everybody, for attending the seminar. So we hope to see you next week again. And well, I mean, thank you very much.
No, thank you all. Thank you very much.
So I'm going to stop the recording.